Hello watch enthusiasts, and welcome to this third episode of the highlights of Watches and Wonders 2020. Now Watches and Wonders, it was meant to be Geneva-based show, has shown some really remarkable watches over the last few days, and today I'd like to speak about Lange Söhne. Now this German brand is very much at the pinnacle of watchmaking. They make some of the finest watches in the world, and across the range, whether you look at their most affordable Saxonia or the very top end of their watches, you'll see incredible watchmaking. And they've chosen to release two new models at this show. The first being a white gold version of their Odysseus, which was a stainless steel model, their first sports watch in fact released last year to fit into the Audemars Piguet and Patek Philippe Nautilus market. And the second watch is something a bit different, because if the Odysseus appeals to someone who wants a Lange but wants it to fit with their lifestyle, this new Zeitwerk minute repeater in white gold is really for someone who wants to immerse themselves in the best watchmaking in the world. This is unashamedly and really pulling out all the stops, one of the most incredible watches you'll ever see, and the movement is absolutely out of this world. And so I'd like to speak about these two watches in today's episode, but please remember that on the Watch Chronicler website we have full articles which will soon be appearing about both of these watches, and plenty more about new releases from the likes of JLC, Piaget and much more for you to read in much greater depth than is addressed here in these videos. But with that said, let's dive straight into these remarkable new watches from Lange Söhne. Now the original Odysseus was launched last year, late last year in fact, in stainless steel, and it was the first standard production stainless steel Lange. Until then, stainless steel had never really been Lange's material. They'd worked primarily with gold and platinum in terms of offering really high-end luxury watches in perhaps a more traditional sense than competitors like Patek Philippe, for example, which was more keen to offer some steel models at the lower levels. And with growing popularity for these, it was only a matter of time before Lange introduced their own sports watch, which incidentally was something else they didn't have, in the form of the Odysseus. Now I must be careful, because the Odysseus was never a watch designed for someone like me, in the sense that it was a watch clearly designed for a particular market opening, rather than being something which was particularly Lange's thing, so to speak. It had a blue dial, a stainless steel case, and an integrated bracelet in terms of following seamlessly from the lugs, although I do know that you can fit a normal strap to it if you want to. And with a 40.5mm case, 11.1mm thickness, and 120m water resistance, it was the perfect luxury watch to be worn every day or in a sports setting. Even the dial with the date and the day on opposite sides of the dial was conducive to wear with short sleeves rather than a smaller double date. So it's an interesting piece, and it's also luminescent too. But the blue dial and integrated bracelet were very much a hint at the fact that it was aiming for that Nautilus market, and it seems to have been well received. I think it's an attractive looking piece, if unconventional. But bearing in mind this, it was only a matter of time before Lange launched a gold version, and they've chosen to go down a more subdued route and go for white gold. Now really this is just a case, strap and dial change, because the case dimensions and design have remained the same, with the pushers on either side of the crown disguised as crown guards, which operate the day and date functions in terms of changing them. And you also still have the small seconds placed at 6 to give that hint to Lange's history and their very particular style of watchmaking, and the movement, the L155.1, remains the same in this watch as it is in the stainless steel model. The biggest change you'll notice is the grey dial, and it has a very different finish too to the standard blue model, in the sense that you have a grained centre to the dial, and then these pressed strakes on the outside of the dial, giving a lot of texture and depth. And I think in this setup it's a more subdued and more attractive look than you get on the steel version, in my opinion. You also still get the beautifully finished lance hands with luminous markings around the dial and on these hands themselves for everyday use. Perhaps the biggest change is the bracelet, or lack thereof. By this I mean that instead of having the stainless steel bracelet seen on the standard watch, this piece comes either with a leather or a rubber strap. And the leather strap is the more traditional choice, of course, but the rubber strap is a more sporty approach, and will really, I suspect, be the more popular choice, just bearing in mind the fact that if you wanted a Lange on a leather strap, you'd get a more elaborate piece at a potentially lower price too. And whilst I've said that this movement hasn't changed, it's still an interesting piece to consider because it's a movement which really does change the priorities you normally see in a Lange movement. Now, it still has the beautiful gold chaton, the blued screws, the exquisite finishing, but there are a few changes. Notably, the beat rate in this movement, as is the same in the steel model, is increased up to 4 Hz. And in the aim of still keeping a long power reserve, we have changes like a more aerodynamic balance wheel, which moves the screws inboard, thus making it a more efficient piece. You also see the power reserve drop to 50 hours from around 70 for the Saxonia movement this piece is based on, and you see a balance bridge, which if you're going to be using this watch whilst swimming or perhaps playing tennis or something like that, will benefit the balance in terms of giving more stability. And so this change means that now the price of the watch has increased from the steel model, because the price for this watch is 39,500 euros, which is not cheap. But if you were already in the market for an Odysseus and you wanted a gold model, this is now your option. The second new piece released by Lange is truly a marvel of mechanical creations. And it's a version of Lange's very famous Zeitwerk model, which is their digital watch in the sense that it has a digital display of the time with discs which rotate around on both sides of the dial with the hours, the minutes and the seconds on a subdial, and the power reserve at 12. However, this piece is something more, because this piece is a minute repeater. And the minute repeater is a very rare complication from Lange, bearing in mind only 2 other pieces have been released by Lange, one of which was a standard production version of this watch, except this new version is a limited run of only 30 pieces and has a blue dial. First, let's start with the superficial, or rather the skin deep, which is a 44.2mm by 14.1mm white gold case. So it has a very hefty case to accommodate the movement, and oh boy, it is a hell of a movement. But the dial is something of a new addition to this watch and is special for this limited edition, because it's blue in its majority of areas, with most of the dial this particular deep blue colour, with a sunburst blue small seconds counter at 6 o'clock, and then a raised metallic piece from which you see the windows for the time. Now, the arrangement on the dial also displays the strikers for the minute repeater on either side of that small seconds counter, and the appearance is highly symmetrical and very, very appealing to my eye. Now, the movement at the heart of this watch is the L043.5, an in-house, obviously, Lange movement, which is a manually wound piece which offers some unique features and really is a spectacle to behold. Now, the movement is almost the same size as this watch, and it takes up the vast majority of the size of the case, as you can see through the exhibition caseback, which I believe is actually larger than the crystal on the front, which is really a testament to the size of this movement. But then when you see the complication this movement has to provide, you can start to understand why it's such a large piece. This movement is also fantastically beautiful, in German silver with those stripes, as well as the screwed chaton on the surfaces, various black polished surfaces, so some incredible areas of hand engraving on the balance cock and also the cock which holds the escape wheel. It's really an incredible thing to see. But there's more than you would normally see as well, because this watch has some serious complications. Now, firstly, this movement doesn't have a terribly long power reserve at 36 hours as a consequence of all of the complication it's running, and because this watch is a minute repeater but uses the mainspring to power this minute repeater rather than having a separate spring for that dedicated function, which most minute repeaters have. This means that if you see the power reserve indicator on the dial, at the 12-hour mark there's a small red dot, after which point the minute repeater won't engage as a consequence of the power reserve being too low and there being a risk of depleting the power reserve altogether. And tracing the complications within this movement, from the mainspring you see something in between that and the escapement, and that's a remontoir, which gives constant force to the escapement. And so this essentially builds up a certain amount of energy that's released into the escapement, and the result is a much more consistent flow, which is important for running these rotating discs for the time. And this is also an interesting piece to look at. I mean, it's stunningly finished with the most incredible anglage, but the most well-known aspect of this movement, though, is the fact that it also has a minute repeater. And unlike normal minute repeaters, this movement functions in a decimal sense. So it reads out the hours, then tens of minutes, and then the individual minutes to tell you the time when you press the button. And this is quite an impressive feature, but the fact that it's been built into a movement like this is all the more remarkable. And the way the minute repeater engages is interesting because it's a sort of controlled, violent release of force, because the ratchet from the spring, the mainspring, is disengaged, and as a consequence it releases its energy extremely quickly into a repeater governor which spins and controls the chiming. And the result of this is a remarkable chime, in addition to a very complicated display of the time as displayed by those two discs. So this piece really is a masterpiece to behold. Of course, the price is considerable, as is always the case with Lange, but all the more with these ultra-complicated, very, very limited pieces. And as with the Piaget I showed yesterday, there's no real way around the price for this 30-piece limited edition at €449,000, which is an enormous amount of money, but I'm glad that watches like this exist because it really does show what people are capable of creating and what watchmakers are capable of creating when they put their minds to it. But I'll conclude this video there, and tell me what you think of these watches in the comments section down below, because Lange always impresses us with remarkable pieces, but I think these pieces show two very different ends of the spectrum. Now do remember to head over to watchchronicler.com and also follow us on Instagram to catch all the latest amongst these new releases. So thank you very much for watching. This is Armon from watchchronicler.com. Out.